The tents were hitched with relative ease, and the beds were unrolled over patches of brown leaves and cushy black loam. The promise of a comfortable night's sleep settled everyone, except for Terracon. The captain's concentration was consistently broken by rampant paranoia. The posts were hammered into the ground, and as he searched for the cord, he noticed the pointed green beak jutting toward him. As he whipped the waxed burlap tarp into the air and let it float over his bed, it revealed the vacant cowl staring. The beaten, frayed hem of the shadowed cloak traced his fingers as it meandered by while Terracon fitted the stakes into place. The campfire beat the shadows off the trees with whipping orange light. The breaking, charred wood coughed orange embers into the air, which sparkled as zephyrs dragged them through the canopy. The Vorsan's frigid nights had followed them into the humid woods, and the crashing fronts rolled angrily through the clouds, occasionally beating the earth with silver whips of electricity. The night let out a sigh so dense that none doubted the rains would soon pour. In the anticipation of the coming weather, however, the knights had found comfort around the fire, roasting spiced sausages fresh from Caldara on dried skeletal branches. Steam, scented sweetly by the tangy blend in the roasting meat, burst through the seams of the sausage's lining, and boiling fat drooled onto the hissing fire. The succulence of the aroma wafting through the air, though not as fine as wyvern fillet, inspired temptations that almost hurt more than the hunger itself. Still, the green beak pointed obsessively toward Terracon, and the captain's appetite could not wrestle his psyche out of the distraction's firm grip. He laughed with Darrell by the trees, having fun at Eloise's expense. Her wit was quick, and she spared no time in having her revenge, affording them an opportunity to share in a moment of merriment together. And yet the empty shroud still haunted. Dion, the first to lance his worst and grill it in the open flame, began at last to nip at it. His yelp, as its juices scalded his tongue, signaled to the others that perhaps dinner was ready. They squatted over tumbled trunks and reached greedily for their sticks. Terracon's hand, however, hung in anticipation only a moment from the branch. Around the fire, the darkened robe drifted, swallowing the orange glow of the flames into the shadowy recesses under its cowl. The shrunken figure's fire-cast shadow grew disturbingly long, waltzing across the trees as it moved around the pit. The hood, empty save for the two thin slivers of glinting light hanging below the green beak, was locked on Terracon. The captain leaned back. It crept closer. Terracon stood up. The shroud was only 2 seats away. The leaves rustled under his boots as he braided his ankles in retreat. It crept closer. The green beak almost jabbed into Terracon's belly. All of him was falling back into some abysmal paralysis. His back bumped a tree. The shadows reached toward him, pinning him against the scratchy bark. He had to do something now, before he was completely consumed by his dread of those charcoal folds. "All right, enough!" He slapped the angular green point growing from the darkness. The green felt beak lifted with little resistance and dragged the black cowl off a head of fire-lit, silver-streaked brunette hairs. A pair of beady yellow eyes darted behind a pair of glinting rectangular spectacles, which rested on top of the knobby nose. The quaint man's braided beard lifted with his mustache-masked smile, whose peculiar normality so disconcerted Terracon that he jumped with an uncontrollable shudder. The dwarf laughed giddily. "Oh," he panted, "he has so much fear. It does hurt." His voice, rich with the dialect, was broken by chains of wild giggling, totally obscuring his words. The fear drained from Terracon's heart, leaving only an outraged vacuum. Impulse blinded his better judgment, and his arm punched forward, shoving the dwarf. "Not funny." The sudden push was stronger than either anticipated, and the dwarf toppled back into the crisp bed of leaves that littered the roots. The offense had not wounded the dwarf, however, who only laughed more heartily. Terracon had not intended to throw him to the floor, but the remorse could not find its way through the labyrinth of rage still floating through him. Incapable of coping with the emotions crashing inside, he abandoned the scene and dropped to a seat by the fire, unwilling to acknowledge anyone, including himself. The dwarf choked his laughter into submission, although the occasional chortle did still chirp out of him as he struggled to stand up. From the ground, he picked up his feathered green felt bicocket with its oblong brim folded neatly into a single point and replaced it to his head. Smilingly, he waddled over to the captain and grasped him around the shoulders. "Oh, you should have seen the look on your face. Please forgive me. It had me too tempted." The dwarf's jovial request, however, did not faze Tarakon's forlorn disposition. Persistent, however, the dwarf pulled a long, warped pipe from deep within his cloak. Another dive into the shadows revealed a leather pouch. Meticulously, the dwarf poured some fragrant black herbs into the bowl. He struck the match against the sole of his boot, but the flicker died as he was ready to lay it over the bowl's mouth. If the dwarf could forgive him, then Tarakon could forgive himself as well. "Here, let me," the captain said, stealing the pipe from the knobby hands. Tarakon's lips pinched, and he blew across the bowl. Orange embers lit within the pipe's bowl, and astonishment lit within the dwarf's yellow eyes. "Ah-ha! What a wonderful youth! Yes, you go!" the dwarf commanded Tarakon the first drag. He relented and pressed his lips to the hollow stem, sipping smoke. He passed the pipe to the dwarf and sniffed the incense drifting through the air. The pull of his breath dragged the sipped cloud from his mouth deep into his lungs. He wrestled against the cough itching in his throat, letting it settle before slowly exhaling an aromatic plume. His eyes closed in response to the numbing that wafted through him. The dwarf laughed again. "You see? No heavy hearts." Tarakon snorted curtly, abandoning the remnant insult floating in his heart. "Tarakon," Nasu said as he approached, "eat up quickly. I want you and Nikken to lead the search tonight." She had known an unquenchable curiosity her entire life. It whispered in her ear. It hung on the tip of her hungry tongue. It wafted unrecognizably in her perfumes. It leaned back endlessly from her finger's approach, and no matter how fast she ran down darkened corridors or across sunny fields, she could only ever scratch it, never snatch it, never have it. That satisfaction was more a mystery to her than any ruin or dish. Sensation was the closest she had come to satisfaction, so she presumed it warranted some importance, that it was the cure to the curse. Sedwa had reached in and, with no effort and as if she had always known right where it lay, found some solace, a compromise enough that Cassandra could surrender and endure. In Sedwa's palm lay a limbo of sensations, textures with no hands to feel, light without eyes to see, whispers without ears to hear, an inundation of experiences so omnipresent that all sense of self disintegrated into the environment, including thought and dream. Cassandra would become a reaction, bent by the world rather than bending the world. Her talents and skills, her hopes and aspirations would waste away. Her thoughts would be as plain as a plane. Her imagination shackled. Cassandra was already shackled, forced to take the moments as they came, were, and went. She would be no happier in Sedwa's hands than she already was, gripping for something out of her reach. She could not find it under her covers in her sleep. It lurked out of her mind, out of her reach, out of her room, out of the castle, far away from her loved ones, across the waters, through the glades and meadows and their tree-lined settings, and even into the heavens. She was a ruin of reactions, haunted by the whispers of things that lived beyond her, others, affects, responses, memories, aspirations. They would scream their demands, tie and quarter her, pull her limb from limb and thought from dream. The paranoid voices rambling their endless prose like pages in a book, blown about in a wild, whirling wind. The book. The thought struck so fiercely that no parry, no matter how well executed, could have denied the target from that thrust. Its location had become a mystery, stashed into the leather satchel, perhaps carried into her room, whether by her or some servant could not be said, and thereafter abandoned, not because of a lack of interest, but simply because too many other things ranked dimensions more relevant, managed to overcome her. Without some knowledge of its location, however, the whole matter seemed futile. It certainly was not in her company, and she could not know if there was anything in its contents worthy of her predicament. Her eyes had been spared but a few glances of the worn pages. Even if she could remember the charm, what good would an illusory cast of imagined fae do her? She could muster an actual assembly simply by calling out to her captors. Only 4 meager words could be otherwise assembled from her memories of the tome. Such meager words had been spoken by ancient tongues, so old that their use had been retained solely by the scholarly, an intellectual jargon whose simplistic vocabulary and complicated construction aided poets in setting an archaic atmosphere to their songs. Despite their foreign quality, the words carried a meaning which many had tried to define, but few were believed to have understood. Without the boundaries of time, Cassandra was free to experiment with them. Hopefully that was all that was needed for black magic to not let her go to waste. She was the heir to the house of Hexen, and for all the glory inherited by her as crown princess, the fact remained that Osmara had been cursed to bear her, proof that their lives were still moved by black magic. None of Marco's bullying could steal that crown from her head, and all of Sedwa's rants would not take that honor from her nobility. Witch was the sole definition of her being, and the world was hers to bend. It was not the chains that needed to break. It was she who needed to be free. Curiosity plucked and pinched and pulled and pecked and left her hollow, a void to compassion or empathy. She plucked at, pinched, pulled, and pecked at every opportunity and excuse, but they were void and hollow of any satisfaction. She wanted to escape as easily as it escaped her. She was escaping it, but it wanted to have her. If she let it have her, could she escape with it? Would it set her free? Deva anutrakum vasanaba. The words had slipped from her mouth, driven from her tongue by curiosity. How curious. She could taste the words. Silence echoed until she could hear it. Darkness blinded until she could see it. Insufficient colors were cast as a pale ghost on a black backdrop, so dark and polished. It was a reflection, her reflection, and she was notably alone. She could make out only her visage in the darkness, with nothing to fight against, nothing to pen her in, nothing to tear down. She could reach forever in every direction and never find anything. She was, however, still wearing Orkhan's cuffs. She was an agent of change and would no longer reflect a life in shackles. Cassandra raised her hand to the visage to pluck and pinch and pull at the cuff. There was a flutter at the approach of her fingertips. She could feel its evasive antics. Her fingers played in its mane. Fingers grew long as they sought to encompass the boundlessness. The skin between each phalange grew wide and taut, stretching the palm into a kite on a metacarpal frame. Invention cast open its membranous wings, fissures stitched into silvery threads through the darkness. The surface cracked and clashed apart, rending her reflection in 1,000 directions. She was scattered into a kaleidoscope of colors, which grew bright and vibrant and loud. The pitch grew into a painful scream for an escape from Cassandra's tearing perception of reality. The ringing echoed into silence. The colors retreated from every nook and cranny of the cell. Cassandra was strewn on the floor. Her cuffed wrists dropped limply at her side. The length of golden chain was swaying limply from the wall, slowly tapping against the stone, ticking rhythmically through the passing moments. The auric link between the tether and the brace was snapped.